This video will tell you everything you need to know before reading the 7th and final Team Fortress story comic. So whether it's your first time learning about TF2's crazy lore, or if it's just been a while and you want a refresher, this one is for you. I've blurred out speech bubbles unless being quoted directly so as to not be distracting or confusing, but with that said, this story summary is primarily about what I'm saying out loud, so if you prefer to treat this like a podcast and only listen, please go ahead. You won't be missing anything too important on screen. So without further ado, let's jump in. TF2 story is set in the year 1972, but the first important event actually happens 122 years earlier in 1850, when a chap called Zephaniah Mann dies. In his last will and testament, he leaves his weapon company, Manco, to a chap named Barnabas Hale. He leaves his land in the New Mexico Badlands equally to his twin sons Redmond and Plutarch, and he leaves everything else to his maidservant Elizabeth, and this includes his supply of so-called miracle gravel, which is widely understood to mean Australium, the most important metal in all of the TF2 universe, which is implied to have many powerful properties, but most importantly to our story is Australium's ability to extend a person's life indefinitely, to slow down or even reverse the effects of aging. Zephaniah's twin sons, however, hated each other, so much so that they started a literal war over the land that their father had left them. It just so happens that they both know a local arms dealer, so they buy a bunch of weapons and employ some local mercenaries to do the fighting for them. 40 years later, in the year 1890, the brothers are starting to worry about dying of old age and therefore losing the war to the other brother. But good news. Remember Elizabeth, the maidservant? Turns out she may be more than just a humble maid, and she does in fact appear to be a trickster manipulator. She shows up and she uses her supply of life-extending Australium to give both brothers machines to keep them alive for at least another 100 years. So we fast forward to 1972 and the war between the two brothers is still going on. The weapons company Manco has been handed down through the generations to a chap named Saxton Hale. And the latest group of mercenaries now employed to fight includes the 9 playable classes that we know and love from the actual game of Team Fortress 2. And they've all got a part to play in the story moving forward. Elizabeth the maidservant has also now been replaced by the administrator. Now, the comic is very deliberate here in 1, not showing that Elizabeth and administrator are the same person, and 2, not showing that they aren't the same person either, or other words implying that they might be family descendants. We of course know that Elizabeth is sitting on a massive supply of Australium, but we do also find out the administrator's name later on in the comics, and, well, it's not Elizabeth. I believe these facts will play a major role in the 7th and final comic, and that the reason that administrator is not named Elizabeth in the modern story will be revealed. Anyway, the war is continuing with no end in sight, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, a new challenger approaches. Grey Man. It turns out that the twins had a third brother all this time who was originally stolen at birth by an eagle, but at some point he gained access to Australium himself, and he too is now alive 150 years later. And just to clarify that number, we do find out from the boy's birth certificate that all 3 were born in 1822. Exactly 150 years before the time that the current story is set. So what is Grey's welcome gift to his long-lost brothers? He kills them. Both. And why? Because he for some reason wants to take over Manco, the weapons company that's been powering the now suddenly ended war that has been going on between the two brothers. The company which is today owned by Barnabas Hale's ancestor, Saxton. So how does Grey plan to take over Manco? With his army of killer robots, which is the lore-based explanation for the in-game man versus machine mode. Today you learned. Well, maybe not you personally, but I'm sure somebody did. We pick up from this point immediately in the first official story comic, Ring of Fire, with Grey Man knocking on the doors of Manco with his aforementioned horde of killer robots. But believe it or not, they won't be necessary today. You see, Manco's modern-day CEO Saxton Hale loves fistfights. In fact, he loves them so much that it is written into the contract of Manco that any CEO who beats him in a fistfight gets to take over the company. No questions asked. But the twist in this plot is that Grey Man has brought along his young daughter, Olivia, who he's also appointed CEO of Grey Gravel Co. Saxton understandably refuses to fight this small child, so technically he loses against her and hands over the CEO-ship of Manco to the approximately 6-year-old girl and 150-year-old father. We have literally no other information about Olivia. For example, who her mother is, or how a 150-year-old Grey fathered her, or whether she really is a small child at all and not in fact a much older person high on Grey's supply of Australium. Olivia only appears twice more in the 6 comics that have been released, and both of these times she's just a background character with no dialogue or actions of any kind. But by the end of comic 6 and before going into the 7th and final part of the story, Olivia is still the CEO of Manco, and is in fact the last known surviving member of the Mann family. I strongly believe we'll be seeing Olivia in the final comic, and that she has some important connection to the administrator and or Elizabeth. Either that or the writers created her for this gag to set up the story and then kind of forgot about her. With Manco now fallen into the enemy's hands, the administrator goes into hiding, and she tells her assistant Miss Pauling and the mercenaries to do the same. We pick things back up 6 months later, and the administrator has sent a message to Miss Pauling asking her to get the mercs back together so that they can try and regain control of Manco. In a series of humorous events, we find the Demoman being a slob at home with his mum, Pyro running a highly successful engineering company, and a soldier running bootleg tours of celebrity homes. We interestingly also run into Marasmus, the recurring wizarding gag character who wreaks havoc on the game in the seasonal Halloween maps. But this does mean that this 6,000-year-old sorcerer is apparently part of official canon. And whilst I love this guy as a character, I really hope we don't see him pull off some Deus Ex Magica in issue number 7. Meanwhile, Grey's motivation for taking over Manco becomes more apparent, as he goes looking for the company's supply of Australium, which he of course himself needs to keep his 150-year-old self alive. But much to his dismay, it has already been swiped by a cigarette-smoking woman, which could be Elizabeth or the administrator, assuming they're not the same person of course. At the same time, he employs a mysterious mercenary of his own to track her down, along with Miss Pauling and our team of mercs. Talking of Miss Pauling and tracking down our mercs, she's just found Scout and Spy. But, slight issue, they're on trial in the town of Twofort for all the destruction caused during their time as warring mercenaries for the red and blue teams, and they're due to be hanged. Fortunately, Demoman and Soldier show up just in time to create a scene and break Scout and Spy free by force. Unfortunately, they also get captured and are due to be hanged. But fortunately, after all, Miss Pauling shows up and reminds the mayor that he doesn't have such power, and pretty easily diffuses the whole situation with facts and logic. A little while before this though, Miss Pauling goes to the Twofort library, and she requests some records and burns them. And we very clearly see that these records are about somebody named Helynt. So to provide full context here, we find out later, after several hints, that Helynt is the administrator's name. The records Pauling requests specifically are genealogy records. In other words, details about a person's biological family such as their parents, or potentially their children. Even more interestingly though, Grey later shows up at the same library and requests census records, which we see in a burned pile. In other words, they're part of what Miss Pauling burned earlier. But this time we also know that the records are specifically for the year 1850. 1850 just so happens to be the year that Zephaniah Mann died. And we know that Elizabeth was a grown woman then because we've got a picture of her and he of course wrote her into his will. So if Elizabeth wasn't born in this year, what is the significance of records from this year specifically? We of course also know that she was known as Elizabeth in 1850, again because of the will. So why do these records from 1850 say the name Helynt? Now, we could go into the weeds about the semantic difference between genealogy records and a census, and indeed my theories on the answer to those two questions that I just posed. But I have actually already made a video going over these specific things in super close detail, so check that out if you want to know what I believe all this evidence is pointing towards. I'll leave a link in the description. But all we know for a fact going into comic number 7 is that the administrator is trying very hard to hide her identity or something about her past, and Grey Man is trying really hard to find it out. Meanwhile, we also learn a bit about Saxton and an old lover of his named Maggie. Unfortunately for Saxton, he seems to have shown more love for his company Manco than Mags in recent years, and she ultimately left him some time ago. Despite this though, she still shows up in his time of need with a plan to help him get Manco back. However, unfortunately again for Saxton, this plan involves accepting the help of Charles Darling, Saxton's former mentor, who he now considers his nemesis. A couple of interesting things to note about Darling. He appears to be a close relative of the Mann family, as what is presumably a relative of his named William Darling was the father of the Mann triplets' mother. In other words, he's their grandfather. So Darling is a living and relatively close cousin to Grey. Darling also wants to obtain as much Australium as possible, and he offers to help Saxton get Manco back if Saxton can help him obtain some more of the magic metal. Perhaps most interestingly, however, is that Charles Darling seems to have advanced knowledge of the administrator's activities within Manco, that even Saxton or Grey seem to be unaware of. At the end of Comic 6, Charles Darling is still alive and apparently invested in what happens to Grey, Manco, and the Australium. So I suspect that he too will show up in the final issue. We also get a quick taste of one of the enduring mysteries throughout this entire saga. Why does the administrator want all the Australium? Why was she manipulating Redmond and Bluetark for over 100 years? These questions persist up until the literal final moments of Comic 6, which we're working our way towards. So surely these answers will also come in the next comic's release. Meanwhile, Scout, Soldier and Pyro go to Siberia to recruit the Heavy. We meet his mother and 3 sisters, and Soldier hooks up with one named Jana, who then joins the gang on their mission to get Manco back. We then find out who the mercenary that Grey Man was talking to earlier is. It's only bloody Heavy from Team Fortress Classic, and 7 of the Classic crew are also part of his Merc squad, and their plan is to follow our Mercs and Miss Pauling until they lead the baddies to the Administrator and the Australium. Why is there only 8 Team Fortress Classic Mercs? Well, surprise, our medic is apparently working with them, seemingly because he just loves conducting medical experiments, so as long as he can do that, he doesn't really care who he's aligned with. We also find out earlier that before helping free Scout and Spy from their impending hanging in the town of Twofort, Miss Pauling had a secret meeting with the Administrator in person, who suggests that she's been through almost the entire world supply of Australium. So she directs Miss Pauling to go get the last remaining stash, which she has yet to acquire herself. She also tells Pauling to forget about Medic, who we now already know is working with the enemy, but also Engineer, meaning that Sniper is the last remaining team member who needs to be picked up. Fortunately, the stash of Australium that Pauling is on her way to collect is just off the coast of Australia, so we can just pick up Sniper on the way. After splitting into separate groups, Heavy and Scout run into Saxton and Maggie at an old depleted Australium stash. We won't see them again for a while, but the fact that they're all together now is what helps them drop in and help the rest of the team a little bit later. Whilst this is going on, we finally get a peek at the Administrator's situation in the flesh, and it is not good. At now over 100 years old, she is completely dependent on Australium-powered machines to keep her alive. The good news is that we finally find out what Engineer is up to, which is maintaining the machines that are keeping her alive. But a stunning revelation is upon us, as now, in the 4th out of 7 comics and 8 years into TF2's lifespan, we finally find out Administrator's true motivation. The thing that has powered her conniving activities for over a century. To settle an old debt. Okay, maybe we don't find out a lot at this stage, but this is a very important moment, and the first time that we've got any idea at all what this old woman's desires really are. These words are also echoed in the very final pages of Comic 6, so this is clearly very important, and will without a doubt be one of, if not the most important reveals to expect in the upcoming comic number 7. Again, for my theories on where this is heading, check out my full video about the Administrator's identity. Back in Australia, the rest of the gang find Sniper hanging out at his adoptive parents' house, and plan to take him to go see his biological parents, who live in a giant underwater glass dome formerly known as New Zealand. Spy, Soldier and Heavy sister Jana, who again is Soldier's new love interest, steal a submarine, and then they meet back up with Pauling, Demoman and now the Sniper, to go on a journey under the sea. In underwater New Zealand, there is a lengthy exchange between Sniper and his biological parents, in a twisted tale which mirrors Superman's origin story. Unfortunately, Sniper's bio-parents are having a bit of a tiff, and in a final act of defiance, his mother selfishly blasts herself into space with a rocket which just happens to be built from the very last supply of the entire world's Australium. This in turn also leaves a massive hole in the glass dome above their heads, causing millions and millions of gallons of seawater to start flowing in. Sniper's bio-dad then drives off in the gang's submarine, leaving no chance of escape. But then, bang bang! The classic mercs show up in their own submarine and shoot Sniper in the chest. Fortunately, the enemies decide to capture the entire squad for interrogation, rather than leave them all to what would otherwise be certain death by drowning. So that was nice. Now with everyone together at Grey's headquarters, we start to see a power struggle between Grey and the classic Heavy, which is resolved almost immediately when enemy Heavy chucks Grey Man into a jail cell and rips his life-giving Australian machine off his back, causing him to rapidly age to around 150 and imminently die. Before he expires, however, he does drop some exposition. He believes Administrator's plans are in some way bad for the world, worse than even his own plans, and he encourages Pauling and the gang to stop her at all costs. And then he dies. During this exposition, Miss Pauling also revealed some coordinates in the New Mexico desert, where the team are due to meet after finding the Australium, which we now know is lost in space. So I presume at some point we'll see the gang reach or try to reach this spot in the final comic. Anyway, Soldier and Shana use their combat skills to break out of the torture situation and then break out Spy and Pauling too. At the same time, Medic appears to switch allegiances, or perhaps just reveals his true allegiances all along, and he kindly brings Sniper back from the dead with a supply of animal organs. And then he also shows great disdain for the way the enemy Heavy was treating him. With Grey dead, the enemy classic Heavy now assumes control and sends an army of blood-sucking robots after our team, and reveals an interesting tidbit about Grey's plans. The only remaining Australium in the world has seeped into the Australium people. So the original plan for these robots was to literally take the Australium out of the Australian population by draining their blood. Fortunately, Demo Man's blood is so full of alcohol it immediately disables some of the robots, giving Medic a chance to help save everyone from the robot damage caused so far. Heavy Scout, Saxton and Maggie then show up in a plane and bring a bunch of weapons to help fight the remaining bots and give us this truly awesome comic panel. We are again reminded that Maggie is emotionally hurt by how much Saxton loves Manco, presumably as it negatively impacts his ability to love her. I highlight this now because this is another thing that I suspect will get some focus in the final comic. Maggie and Saxton's relationship. Will Maggie accept Saxton's love for the company? Will Saxton relinquish control of Manco to give more focus to her? Or will they accept that it's simply not meant to be for them? All the while, the enemy mercs have been slowly killed off by the rest of our mercs, and a series of bonding moments occur between many of our squad, including Spy apparently revealing himself as Scout's real father. Enemy Heavy then shoots Medic dead. But whilst in hell, Medic manages to trick the devil into bringing him back to life, and he then, along with friendly Heavy, avenge his own murder by killing enemy Heavy, together with a combination of distraction and ripping off Grey Man's Australian machine, which enemy Heavy had earlier attached to himself. On his deathbed, classic Heavy drops some exposition which has always stood out to me. He mentions a Team Echelon, a Team Citadel, and a Team Vanguard. This means that Team Fortress is kind of like a code name for our specific team. It also tells us that Administrator has apparently been pulling similar tricks with many other mercenary teams, all the while she's been pulling the strings with ours. Were there at some point at least 3 more teams of mercs out there? Are there at least 3 more Miss Paulings? I honestly don't think this will play into comic number 7, but I do think understanding Fortress as a codename is something that never occurred to me before reading this scene. We have now reached the final scenes in the story so far. But what follows is the hugest exposition dump in the entire series, most of which will no doubt underpin the majority of the story in the upcoming final comic. the final titillating hints about Administrator's mysterious plan. She reveals that whatever her plan is and the reason for wanting to stay alive is not just for her. This is the old debt that needs to be repaid. She says she wants to keep this going for as long as she can, although she admits that she thought she was done once. Done as in defeated? Or done as in completed her goal? It's not entirely clear. Whatever it is, though, she craves it as much as she did when she was just a little girl. She says she'll never stop wanting it, and that it has become everything. And again, whatever it is that she's alluding to, she thinks that she can fulfill it in just 1 hour, because she then proceeds to huff down the last remaining supply of Australium in the entire world and reduces her age dramatically to an appearance even younger than when we first saw pictures of Elizabeth in 1850. So, in summary of the summary, the whole gang is now together, minus Engineer, but plus Miss Pauling, Heavy Sister / Soldier's Lover Jana, Saxton Hale, and his old love Maggie. I should also mention that there's a newly born baby baboon. I honestly don't think that will be relevant, but you know, this is Team Fortress, so you never know. All the baddies are now dead. Redmond, Bluetark, Grey, and the entire cast of TF Classic Mercs, all expired in one way or another. Everyone except Olivia Mann, the surprised child daughter of Grey Man, who at this point in the story is still the owner of Manco, and theoretically the last person standing in the way of Administrator Saxton and everyone else taking Manco back. There is also one Charles Darling, who is also after the Australium, but we are now led to believe it is completely gone. Does Darling have ulterior motives, or now that the Australium has entirely run out, does his interest in Manco also run out, and we simply won't hear from him again? It should be noted that Elizabeth, who may or may not be the same person as Helynt / the Administrator, almost definitely knew one of Charles Darling's ancestors. So some sort of history between Charles and the Administrator is not out of the question. But finally, and most critically, Administrator has a very important plan, specifically relating to a debt being repaid. Given what we know about everyone else in the story, to whom could she possibly owe a debt that is still alive? And why could she owe them such a debt? Something that she says has become everything to her, that she has wanted since she was a little girl, and that was so vital to her that she happily reduces her life to just 1 single hour in order to repay it. Well, it seems we'll all find out soon. In the meantime, check out my video linked on screen right now, where I go into excruciating detail on why exactly I believe the Administrator goes by both the names Helen and Elizabeth. And be sure to subscribe for more videos, including a breakdown when Comic 7 is finally here.